So I'm Sarah Kapnick, or Dr. Sarah Kapnick. I am a climate scientist by training. I am currently the global head of climate advisory. Still remembering that, at JP Morgan. And I know I've interacted with a bunch of you during my time actually at NOAA, where I was the chief scientist most recently for the last couple of years. And so I've returned to the bank, and I bring in climate science and technology background from all the science that I've overseen in my career, to be able to help strategically think about how the science is going to affect us, affect business, affect investing, and try and help everyone be smarter. So could not be more excited to be here for this war game. I think is really important to getting people to think about scenarios you've never seen before and how you would act in that moment. In my experience doing this with the intelligence community and with defense, but also emergency managers around the United States, this is how you find out where your breaking points are and where you really gain new insights, because you take yourself out of your normal box of thinking and think totally differently. So thank you.
Yeah. Just before we kind of get into questions, because you do know the science behind it, can you give a little bit of context to AMOC and what we're already seeing in the I think what has surprised me when I first learned about it is the inevitability of it to some extent, because it does seem like one of those things that's way out there that it's slow moving and may never actually impact us.
Yeah. It's actually funny, on the airplane over, the person sitting next to me saw The Day After Tomorrow and started talking to me about it, which is the only time that's ever been in the popular press. It was a movie in 2004, I think. But it is something that's been starting to write about in science fiction because it's becoming so real as something that is actually already starting to happen. So with this ocean conveyor belt, if that stops, heat stops being transported from the equator up northward, and that heat goes towards Europe. So if you think about Newfoundland versus parts of the UK, they're vastly different climates. It's very, very cold in Canada. It's much warmer in the UK and in Northern Europe. The reason is because of that temperature warming that comes up. If AMOC were to fully collapse, Europe gets on average for the year colder by 10 to 15 degrees centigrade. That fundamentally changes what you grow in Europe. That changes the insulation requirements in everyone's homes. It changes the need for how buildings are constructed. It changes energy demand. It changes everything. You also actually, through that flow of water that is steadily going towards Europe, it also actually changes sea levels across all the Atlantic basin. And so the way that we know that AMOC is already slowing down is we're actually getting more flood days, and sea level height in the last 10, 15 years is about 7 or 9 centimeters higher than it was in the decades prior. So calculations of what that means actually is that 20 to 50% of flood days along the East Coast are actually already due to this slowing down, which is approximately 8 days a year of flooding on the East Coast that we get now that we actually didn't have in the past.
Thank you. Much better explanation. Okay, so with what you think a lot about the increasing economic impacts of major climate events on businesses and corporations. I feel like it is a conversation that seems to be seeping into kind of the public domain more and more. But how many, I guess, corporations are really activating their strategic planning around physical climate risk? And if they aren't, what do you think is preventing that?
The ones with traditional exposure to extreme weather have had more planning. So actually, S&P does this great survey where they go out and they do a survey of all the biggest companies, and they put it out and they ask them a bunch of questions. And the sector that's thinking the most about adaptation and physical risk are utilities. Reason being, you have a storm come through, you have a wildfire, you have a hurricane, you have damages, people don't have energy, they get very upset. Those utilities have figured out how to have a disaster plan, go out, restore power. And also, post 2017, the fire seasons in Northern California that led to the bankruptcy of PG&E, there's also a market reason they're starting to do it. Because of that bankruptcy from the wildfires that occurred and the downgrading of PG&E, the bankruptcy, but also the criminal liability that then occurred with the board members of utilities became very hypersensitive to it. So the investors did and the board members did, which has then driven behavior to trying to figure out what is our risk, what is our exposure, what can we do about it, how do we spend. However, it's only recently that those companies that have been spending, so now we're about 8 years after that, it's only recently that one utility had a ratings upgrade due to their spending on resilience. So despite actions, it didn't show up in the market. And so there wasn't a market signal also. And so one of the ways I conceptualize this is it's a risk management problem. You know that these events are going to happen in the future. However, there's uncertainty assigned to that. And the uncertainty goes down because of the amount of climate change that happens and also just the inevitability of probabilities at a certain point. And so there's a real question about when do you choose to act? And depending on a C-suite, depending on us individually, we all have different thresholds where we actually act. And that is leading to this not being pervasive, where people are starting to actually adapt and figure that out.
Are there any, so utilities seem like an obvious one. Are there any less obvious actors who are doing this well, and have they received any market signal?
We're starting to see it also in consumer brands, particularly any with an agricultural focus, and that's because of commodity prices and price spikes due to droughts. The best examples from this have been in coffee as well as in chocolate, because the droughts that we experienced from the recent La Niñas is also the El Nino of 23-24, there was a spike in the prices because those droughts led to exposures, led to problems in the prices up. And certain companies really took a hit on that in their markets because they hadn't hedged it and they hadn't planned for it. And what I'm starting to see is it's not just traditional risk management of we're going to hedge our commodities to be able to make sure that we have the pricing that we need. You're also starting to see it actually in the R&D in consumer brands of thinking, okay, the future looks like this. If I depend on these certain types of seeds or these certain types of agriculture and I'm in this region, can I have geographic diversity so that if there's a drought in one location, it doesn't hit another? Or do I need to start rethinking the strains of these different types of seeds, these different type of commodities? So I start planting differently. So then I have different genetic diversity that maybe does better under a drought. Those conversations, I'm starting to see them happening. I'm starting to get examples of those taking place. But it's really only beginning, and unfortunately, it's often only after a shock that companies are forced to really do this thinking and actually act, because they have this recency bias that problems haven't happened, I don't need to be considering it. If I invest in that, I don't think that the market's going to respond and reward me for that. It will be a waste of money, so I'm not going to start doing it until I'm required to do it. And so there's different frameworks for how people are starting to think about adaptation.
Yeah, when I think about cacao or coffee beans, I mean, those plants, if like a established coffee farm or plantation, like those are old vines, those are old roots that takes decades to really reestablish. It seems like maybe a lot of people are starting too late. But you just have to start. Can you speak a little bit about the hidden costs of just maintaining the status quo? Because I think even in a compelling scenario where you know something is going to happen, it is that recency bias of, oh, just one more day, I can buy myself just one more day until there's that shock in the system. Can you talk a little bit about like the framework around maintaining status quo?
Yeah, because a lot of the analysis for this type of work is based on what historic costs have been. there is a requirement of bringing in climate information to understand what your risks and exposures might be in the future, which leads to some of this inaction. And so when I talk to different companies about how they're trying to adapt or think about it, I'll say there's 4 main buckets that they take place. They're either, they know what the climate science is, they're worried about it, they want to adapt as fast as possible, and I call them early adapters. They go out and they do it as fast as they can. Others say, I'm worried about it, but I'm also worried about the uncertainty because I don't want to act too quickly. And so they're amortizing adapters. They do it slowly over time with a certain amount of money. They make a plan, and they figure out what they can spend over time. And they also, typically, in this deep thinking, are also thinking about, okay, if I adapt a little bit now, but I also need to adapt more 10 years from now, maybe I'm going to need to retrofit some things 10 years from now because there'll be less uncertainty, so I can continue to spend in the future when I know more. And so they spend over time. And then there's others, they want as much certainty as possible, or they want to wait until the markets really start moving, or they get forced by their investors. And so I call them procrastinating. They're waiting until they have some signal that is going to really push them. But then there's others, because this is a risk issue for many, they don't act until they have perfect certainty, and sometimes that's too late when you have risk, and that's when you get a bankruptcy or otherwise. And I think another piece of this also is that, even when I say it, because I come from a science background, I think about it mainly in terms of risks, but there are real opportunities to beginning to adapt and have that product or have that capability when everyone else does not during an event or during climate change in the future. And we're starting to see shifts in that, where certain companies are realizing that there will be needs to adapt, and they want to be the first into the market doing that.
Have you done any assessments? Because there's a lot of assets out there, and people think about how to maintain their assets of today and what kind of assets they need to invest in the future. And I imagine that in a world of climate change, of increased fire exposure or rising sea level, like there's an assessment that needs to be done related to physical climate risk and how that makes you think about what assets you abandon or where you reinforce or where you build new assets. Has there been any assessment done on that?
Yes. So an interesting part of this too is as cities or states also realize that they have exposures, and maybe it's a signal that they get because of insurance rates in a certain location, or questions from investors as they're trying to figure out their muni plans, or the engineers identify something. They're starting to do these assessments of, if we want operations in this location or we want to have the business in these places, what do we need to do and spend to have resilience for long-term operations? And so actually individual states as well as cities, and I'll be US-centric here, in the United States are starting to do this. It's really heavily along the coast because of sea level rise and increase in flood days are already putting the pressure on this. So is insurance rates because of hurricanes. But you're also starting to see it also in the Midwest, where states have adaptation plans already starting to be in place. So they're creating these plans of, okay, where do we need to spend money as we're doing our infrastructure? What are the standards that we need to do this, and how are we going to implement it? And I'll give an example. Recently, the state of Maryland, the comptroller, actually put out an entire report about climate planning for Maryland because of sea level rise issues, as well as concerns about hurricanes, and also even though it's on average you get less snowstorms, the snowstorms can be actually much larger when you actually do get one. And that is a real problem for municipalities because they have a set amount of money they want to work on every single year. So if you follow the average, you say, oh, I don't need to spend on snowplows anymore. It can decline with the amount of snow. But then when you actually get that one storm, it shuts down everything for a week because you don't have any of the capacity.
Something that you wrote in your climate intuition, I mean, it's a simple statement, but it makes a lot of sense, is that like a business without adaptation, eventually it destroys value. It erodes value. But at the same time, what I heard you say at the beginning is for the utility companies, for example, for all the money they've spent and the ways in which they've acted, there's been no, there's the ROI, at least from the market, the signals have been lacking. So how do people think about the ROI of climate adaptation in their businesses?
And because of this original risk framing, most people thought of it as a pure cost, that you were just trying to avoid a loss in the future. And it was seen as something that was, you put it in and then you don't have a loss. And if you go a few slides, starting about 3 years ago, business groups, West, Chamber of Commerce and others have started creating reports and analyses about trying to understand what the return on investment of adaptation would be. So if you invest $1, how much do you have in avoided losses or return on being able to do that? And depending on the sector and geography now, those returns are around $2 to $43 per investment. And so the analysis is starting to come out that there is a return on investment. I will say from my time at NOAA, I started implementing this requirement for all of the resilience spending we did on coastal resilience, because it's not actually something that is standardized to be able to collect this type of information to know what it is. And I think a large part of a misunderstanding about need to do this or that there's a return on investment is because the time horizons are so long and we haven't actually done this type of analysis. I'll also add, if you go to the previous slide, there's also starting to be analyses coming out of different groups on, if you do nothing, what is the value lost? And so this is, on an annual basis, over $1 trillion in damages would occur to S&P, I forget what it was, S&P companies, if they do nothing on adaptation and resilience. So if you maintain the complete status quo, you don't plan for climate change, these are the damages that are going to start being seen by 2050. And so those are growing over time. But this all assumes no adaptation takes place. I expect that adaptation will take place, but it's how does one do it? How do you strategically do it? And how do we not see these types of massive losses that we could experience?